All right, so my name is Gabriel Lang. I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It's my pleasure to introduce Rajiv Maheswaran from Second Spectrum, who's here today to give his talk titled The Three Dimensions of Rebounding. The talk will be for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A, which we will take over to the side here. So at the end of the talk, just come to the side, we'll have a mic. So please join me in welcoming Rajiv to the stage.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be here. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Yuhan Chang, Jeff Su, Sheldon Kwok, Tal Levy, Adam Wexler, and Noel Hollingsworth. I can tell you that one of the dimensions of doing research and having fun doing it is having a ridiculously cool and talented team to work with. That's pretty much the key right there. So let me dive right in. So this is a slide. We work a lot with data, and I love throwing this slide up there where it's, Einstein on his board says, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So it sort of captures the fact that what you're measuring and what you want to measure are different and all the complexities involved in doing that. And I just found out that he actually never said that. He never actually wrote that on his board. And it's sometimes the things you think you know are not true. So let's go to basketball. These are the things that we thought we knew and we were measuring, and we tried to get stuff out of them. And from a lot of talks today, you probably know that now these are the things that we know. And we try to get stuff out of this. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I took a dive into this stuff. And if you're not familiar with this data and the work that we did, here's a quick summary.
What's happened is in the last decade or so, we've just been able to collect lots and lots of data in places we've never been able to collect before. Now the question is, what do we do with all this data? Basketball is kind of a dance. There's always sort of moves and counter moves, pick and rolls and screens. The statistics we have right now are the best we can do as a function of the box score. This guy took a shot, that guy got a rebound. Now with this new optical tracking data, you get to see the game in a way that you can never see it before. So the question is, how do you translate that data into something that can help them win? Before, taking a long two-point shot was a bad idea because it had a low probability of going in. What we figured out was, not only is it bad for that reason, it's bad because that's the worst type of shot to try and get back. These are new insights that we're able to get from the data that we didn't have before. Slight shifts in strategy, slight changes in which players you play, which plays you run, are going to affect who wins and loses. These are all the things that are not that different in sports and in business. If you know more, if you can see more, you can make better decisions. And data is a way of making what was invisible visible. It's an art in and of itself.
So that happened. If you didn't quite get that, it was basically, very quickly, it was we looked at rebounding and basically found another reason that long two-point shots were terrible, and a whole bunch of other things that basically had to do with a high-level strategic aspect of sort of team rebounding. Now, it turns out that's pretty much the tip of the iceberg. It was sort of scratching the surface of what was possible, and everybody asked us afterwards, like, that's neat, but what I really want to know is about players. Tell me about players. Tell me who's good at rebounding, who's not good at rebounding. And so the answer is easy, right? You go to the box score, and you see, count the number of rebounds, and the three dimensions of rebounding are offensive rebounding, defensive rebounding, and total rebounding, right? End of story. But perhaps there's more to it than that, because sometimes, because we count a stat called rebound, it doesn't necessarily mean that rebounding is a skill all unto itself. I was listening to this guy named John Wooden. If you don't know him, he was a famous college basketball coach. He won a lot of games and a lot of championships. He was talking about some of the best players he coached and what made them good, and specifically rebounding. I'll let him tell him himself.
And neither one could jump very well, but they kept good position, and so they did well rebounding. They remembered that every shot is taken, they assumed it'd be missed. I've had two men that stand around, wait to see if it's missed, then they go, it's too late. Somebody else is in there ahead of them.
So he's already started talking about the fact that there's much more complexity to it. There's positioning, there's going and getting the ball. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at what we're talking about when we're talking about rebounding. So now we count rebounding. So we think rebounding is a scale, but rebounding is really, there's a life cycle, a timeline of rebounding. So what's the life cycle? It starts with somebody taking a shot. Then that shot goes and misses. And then the ball goes off the rim, and some players end up being close to the ball. And one of those players, perhaps, converts that into a rebound. So there's sort of it's not an instant of thing, it's sort of a life cycle of what happens. And the whole rebounding process is going on throughout this life cycle. Now, smart people who said, we shouldn't be counting rebounds, we should be taking rebounds and dividing by the number of opportunities people had. And so we came up with rebound percentage, and that's been a different metric for a while. But really, there's a lot more to it, right? So, because we know, one of the things we know is when the shot is taken, not everybody is standing in the same place. Not everybody has the same chance at getting the rebound. Some people are standing right next to the basket. Some people are standing at the three-point line. So really, everyone has an initial likelihood of getting the ball when the shot is taken. Then stuff happens. The ball gets to the rim. People shuffle around. They crash. They block out. And those probabilities change. Then they have a different probability at the rim. And then after the ball bounces off the rim, some players get themselves close to the ball. You might call it nose. You might call it something else. And they create an opportunity. And how often do they get close to the ball given how many chances they have is an opportunity percentage. So there's this second layer of numbers we can have associated with various points in this life cycle of a rebound. And you can look at differences of those and come up with various different metrics. So you can say, okay, but the time between the shot and the rim, I'm going to call that crash or blocking out. The change in that value is a measure of crashing or blocking out. I can look at how many opportunities I get versus the opportunity level I start with and see how much opportunity I added. I can see how often I converted into a rebound once I got an opportunity. And I can see how well I do above my position. So there are all kinds of deltas on this that we can look at. So how are we going to look at all these various things? So the way we suggest looking at it is this is how we came up with the 3 dimensions. Is the first one is positioning, because at some point you basically have some initial value and it's different for every player for every shot. And then, this is poorly named, we call it hustle, but we know that's a sort of it's a more interesting name. But the idea is that given where you started, you get yourself additional opportunities beyond your expectation. So you get yourself to the ball more often or less often than you would based on your positioning, and that's a measure of your skill. And then third of all, you get yourself close. Some people can get themselves close but not get the ball. And then the ability to convert is the third skill. So if there were a simple formula for rebounding, we would say, okay, rebounding is a bunch of opportunities and how often you convert them, multiplied by how often you convert them. Opportunities are your initial positioning and how much you hustle beyond that, for lack of a better word. Therefore, rebounding is positioning plus hustle times conversion. So it turns out it's not quite as simple as this. You don't necessarily want to measure it like that, but it gives us a high-level framework from which to work from. So the first question, and this is what makes it tough, is how do you assign a quantitative value to positioning? How do you tell somebody this is the number you have based on where you're standing? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a sort of a spatial analytics technique. It's called the use of Voronoi tessellation. So what you do is we carve up the court based on where everyone is, based on the area that is closest to you. Everybody owns a little piece of real estate, and that real estate changes as you move. And the question now is, if you can carve up the court into various pieces of real estate, how do you assign value to that piece of real estate, because they're not all worth the same. So let's say there was a shot. This was the configuration. A shot was taken from the left corner there. We can carve up the court to see who owns the various parts of the court by this Voronoi tessellation, which is who's basically closest to each one of those spaces. Then we can make a model of where the ball is going to go, where the ball is going to be rebounded, given that the shot was taken there. And that sort of gives you the value of the various spaces on the court. And then you integrate that into basically the value on the cell, and so you multiply the cell by the probability of the cell. So you can see that the two players who are closest to the basket, even though they have smaller cell areas, have a much greater value than the players who are further out. So the idea is if you treat everybody equally, you say this is the amount of real estate you own based on where you're standing, this is how much it's worth, that's your initial value. We certainly don't expect all players to translate that into rebounds at the same level, but that is a measure of the other skills. So it gives us a baseline. So let's look at who actually is good at this. So if you look at power forwards and centers on the offensive side and defensive side, these are the players who have the highest initial positioning for shots. These are players who have been on the court for at least 500 missed shots through, I think, mid-February this year. So you can see there are a lot of bigs, a lot of people who end up standing very close to the basket. There could be other things involved. There could be anticipation involved. That's something we can look at. But at a high level, you can see people sort of who you expect to be very close to the basket. So these players, you expect them to have higher rebound rates. So the key thing is the rebound rate doesn't take into account for the fact that some people are just standing where lots of rebounds are going to happen. So that's why it's not necessarily a complete picture of who's a good rebounder. So if you take away the bigs, if you take away the power forwards and centers, you get, these are the players who have the highest initial position for being ones, twos, and threes. And it's interesting, you'll see sort of Jeremy Evans, Chris Singleton, and Carmelo Anthony being high on both lists. So I could talk about this for more, but I'll keep going on. So now we have positioning. Before we go on to hustle and conversion, I'm going to talk about just crashing for a second, but it's going to be instructive. Because a simple way to get a value for these metrics is just subtract the number associated with one endpoint with the number associated with the previous endpoint, but that's not a good idea, and I'll show you where. So let's just look at crashing, which is the difference between your likelihood of getting the rebound when you take the shot and when the ball hits the rim. So this is the graph for the defensive end. So the x-axis is the probability of you getting the ball closer to the rim, and the y-axis is how much you improved or lost probability based on by the time the ball hit the rim. So you'll see all the purple people are centers, the reds are power forwards, the greens are small forwards, blues are point guards. So bigger people tend to have higher probabilities when the shot is taken. They also tend to have, the bigs tend to lose probability, and smaller players tend to sort of gain it. And that makes sense because when a shot is taken, people attack the place where the probability is, so bigs are going to lose probability. So the question is, it's not really fair to have a crash rating based on the absolute difference, because you'll say all the people who are good at crashing or blocking out are guards, because they're the ones who have the highest numbers. So how do we create a proper expectation model? So we regress and we say, well, given that this is where you're standing, and this is likely, your initial probability, how much probability do we expect that you add or will lose, and how do you perform with respect to that? Right, so now you can see that there are going to be bigs who are above the line, and bigs who are below the line, and smalls who are above the line, and smalls who are below the line. So if we look at who's good on defense there, now we have a list of players that includes bigs, like Kevin Garnett and Kevin Love, who would not have been listed otherwise. So these are the players who either, on the defensive side, either crash or block out and have the highest effect of increasing the probability of getting the rebound beyond what is expected based on their positioning. You'll notice that the Pacers have 2 of the top 4 in the league as of February. So, and Carmelo Anthony appears again. His name is scattered throughout this talk. So on the offensive end, it's very interesting. You still have a scatter plot like this in terms of defensive initial value of your probability at the shot and how much it changes. Here, the slope of the curve is going upwards instead of downwards. So what that's saying is people who are closer to the basket tend to attack more and are more likely to improve their probability, and people who are further away don't. So this is pure speculation, but it's the idea that on the offensive side, the people who have a chance might attack, and the people who don't hang back. But again, that would be consistent with this, but I haven't looked into that in great detail. So who are the best offensive crashers? So there you have a list: Gortat, Lopez, Collison, Zeller. We always have to be careful about offense. I'm much more comfortable about defense because offense includes all kinds of strategic implications by the coach. So I always take the offense with a grain of salt. So there might be players who are good at this who are not trying. They're abandoning position. So I wouldn't sort of, but the defensive rankings, you would think that everyone's sort of going after rebounds, so there's value there. But I show it for interest. So Tristan Thompson and Anderson Varejao, 2 Cavs there. So now that we understand, so that the critical point there, and this is what we'll use throughout the rest of the talk, is that when you break down the life cycle of a rebound and you put values to various points, you shouldn't just subtract, because everything is a function of positioning. Positioning affects the other 2 dimensions. So we'll do this, throughout the talk. So let's look at hustle on defense. So what hustle, again, poorly worded, but is the idea of how much probability you add beyond your positioning. Okay? how likely you are to get to be closest to the ball beyond what was projected when the shot was taken. So you can see that there's a slight negative correlation from positioning there to hustle. So we make that adjustment there. Again, there's a slight positive correlation on the offensive end from positioning to hustle. And there you have it, the hustlers of the NBA. We have Udo, Clark, and Cousins on the offensive end, and Scola, Aldridge, and Aminu significantly above everybody else. But these are the players who basically, over a large sample size, get to be closest to the ball much more than you would expect them to be, given where their positioning is when the shot was taken. So then we've got conversion. So conversion is a skill that says how well do you convert, get a rebound when you're closest to it. Again, sort of we look at defense. A positive correlation, it means the closer you are, in general, the more likely you are to capture the ball. Same thing on offense, the closer you are, the more likely you are to catch the ball. So here's the list of offensive and defensive players. Gerald Wallace converts the ball 30% more than you would expect for someone in his position. Notice Lance Stevenson appears twice, both on the offensive and defensive end. And if you look at the list for defensive conversion, you'll see, a lot of big names on there: LeBron, Carmelo, Durant, KG, Kevin Love. And it's interesting, and this is sort of anecdotal. We've looked at the list for defensive conversion. Defensive conversion seems to be correlated very highly with who the general public would think are very awesome players, even if you take that list from like 10 to 20. So it seems, this is again anecdotal, I mean, we'd have to share the list, is that there seems to be a high correlation between defensive conversion ability and being a very good player. I don't know if that's something that would be interesting to look into deeper. So one way another thing we can do with these three dimensions is sort of combine hustle and conversion, because you say, okay, you have your initial position, that's what you're sort of given, then how do you do beyond that position? And so that's an ability to say how well do you perform better than what your positioning is, because it's unclear if positioning is something you can add. You can't just have everybody have a 30% initial position if you take three bigs and put them close to the basket, because there's only so much probability to go around. But it's very interesting to see which of these stats are composable and not composable when you're trying to put teams of players together. So this is basically say how much do you outperform your position? How much does your rebound percentage differ from your positioning? So we can see that on the defensive end, again, there's a slight defensive negative correlation. It's harder to outperform positioning if you're closer to the basket. On the offensive end, it's pretty flat. There doesn't seem to be a large effect as a function of position. So here are the top players who basically outperform their positioning over the league on the offensive defensive sides of the court. I mean, and the key thing about all of this is it removes the positioning, because a lot of rebound rate is highly correlated with basically initial positioning. So the question is, how much does that tell you about their skill in rebounding? Is positioning a skill, or is that just a matter of what defense you're playing, where your coach is having you stand, or is there something about it that's innate for the player, that he knows the shot is coming and moves into a position? So that's one of the open questions sort of to answer. If you look at this list, there are some interesting nuggets. This is what I didn't know. Al-Farouq Aminu is in top 10 in both offense and defense. I would not have thought, I'm not a full observer, but I would not have thought of his name as one of the elite sort of defenders, but he really pops out. You get some usual suspects. Players who are top 20 in both offense and defense and RB plus are Kevin Love, DeMarcus Cousins, and Kenneth Faried, and that sort of passes the smell test. And Iman Shumpert is interesting because he's a guard who's good at both. He's sort of top 30 or top 31 in both. So I'm a fan of John Wooden, and he has this quote that I really love. It says, "Don't measure yourself by what you've accomplished, but what you should have accomplished with your ability." And I think it speaks to a lot. I think in a lot of other sports, in baseball, you sort of have this notion of expectation. And it's not what you do, but what you do compared to what you should have done or an average player would have done in that position. So perhaps he could have said, don't measure rebounding by what you have rebounded, but what you have rebounded given your positioning. I don't know that that's true because I don't actually know. It's an open question as to whether positioning is just something that anyone can have or it's something that you have to fight for, whether hustle can be taught and improved, whether conversion rates can be improved with training. Those are the interesting questions to answer next. I think there are two big points. One is the fact that for this kind of research, for all of basketball, is that sometimes a thing you think is a skill is really many, many things. And the reason we miss the fact that a thing is many things is because we're not measuring correctly. The second big thing is the fact is that it's not what you're doing, it's what you're doing compared to what you should be doing. And these are the sort of same things that we're applying to lots of other things, to shooting, going off screens. The same idea that one thing might be many things and you should compare to expectations. Some of the questions I asked about whether positioning, hustle, and conversion are innate, whether they can be trained, whether they can be changed through strategy are interesting. These are the things we're going to be looking over for the next couple of years. I don't know. It's an exciting time to be in sports analytics. I don't know, how or when they're going to be answered, but I certainly know that we'll be hacking away at the iceberg until we solve them. So thank you for your time.
Great talk. I just had a question about the initial positioning, the vortex data there at the beginning. I noticed that most of the defenders' triangles were, pointed more toward the outside away from the rim. Is that an assumption, or does that account for where the player is facing?
No, it doesn't account for where the player is facing. The Voronoi cells basically just say, the cells just are a function of saying, if we take this room, I get all the space that I'm closest to more than anyone else in the room. And it just so happens that that's what the shapes look like. But it basically says, my cell is everything I'm closest to. That's really that's all it says. Yep.
Have you thought of any ways for your model to account for boxing out and that scale and
So,
quantifying that?
Absolutely. So I think this really actually quantitatively, it takes into account boxing out. So for example, if the hoop is here and there's all this great probability over here, I probably want, if by boxing out, I'm giving myself this cell so I get all that probability. If I know the hot spot is here, and I come here and somebody comes right behind me, I've given up half that probability to the other player. So this really values players who box out because you're controlling the cell, you're really controlling the cells that have probabilities. And we've talked to a lot of people in the league, and there's the idea that there are players who maybe don't know the math, but intuitively know this. The Rodman watching Jordan taking rebounds. He knows where the value is, and he knows how to protect that value. It would have been great to have this when he was around, so we could sort of explain that. But really, this does actually quantify things, the value of sort of boxing out and getting space for yourself.
Thanks.
Yep.
Are you concerned at all that some guys might kind of pad their rebounding stats because they're more concerned with getting rebounds than playing on the ball defense? So someone like Kevin Love, for instance, people say he plays defense not looking at the shooter, but he plays looking at the basket.
Okay, so there's no orientation, so I can't tell that, but it does penalize a player. So if you do look at positioning independent stats, the RB+, it does penalize a player for just standing close to the basket because it says, if I'm just gonna sort of stand close to the basket and wait for rebounds, my positioning value will be very, very high. And so the difference between my positioning and my rebound rate is going to be low. So it will adjust for that there. Now there are other effects you can't take into account. For example, if they leak early before the shot is taken, then we're not taking that into account because that's pre-shot. So the way we could deal with that is sort of look a few seconds before the shot to see if a person's sort of abandoning. But then that's an argument there because somebody might say, oh, if they're abandoning the shooter, perhaps it's not a good idea. But if they're abandoning somebody else to go to a higher probability value before the shot is taken, somebody might say maybe they have good instincts for when the shot is going to be launched and they go to a better position. These are all things that I don't know right now.
Look at the field goal percentage if someone's defending the shooter.
Sure, yeah.
Did you happen to look at who the worst rebounders were? And if so, was there anyone who stood out across the board as consistently underperforming?
Okay, so what I would say is there's no such thing as a worst rebounder, but there are people who are bad at various different skills or have low numbers at different skills. So I think that, certainly one of the big things, and I don't want to tell you this, there are players who, so this is the hardest thing we have is players who underperform their positioning. So somebody who's has a really high rebound rate, right? And everybody thinks they're a great rebounder, but the bulk of that value comes from positioning. So let's say somebody is a 28 at positioning and they get 20% of the rebounds, we say, oh, that guy's, or and we do the adjustment, he says he gets 5% less than anybody else, you know, in his position. It's like, but he's a great rebounder. It's like, well, he is, but that's mostly because of where he's standing. Now, if you believe that standing, you know, close to the basket when the when the shot is taken is a skill, then yes, he has a skill. But if you don't, then it might put particular players in a bad light. So that's an issue that sort of needs to be worked out. And it's an open question, and depending on who you talk to, and we've talked to a lot of people, some people believe positioning is a skill, and some people believe it isn't. And you have to be careful of that, because I can't just take somebody like, you know, I can't take, you know, Muggsy Bogues and put him where Hibbert is standing and expect him to perform the same. But you would expect that even in that situation, Muggsy would underperform way more than, let's say, Hibbert would over or underperform, right?
All right, thank you very much.